Today, we're tackling a figure so monumental, so central to the American story, that his name is almost synonymous with the nation itself: George Washington. Now, when we think of Washington, images often spring to mind: the stoic general, the first president, the face on the dollar bill. But beyond the marble statues and the simplified narratives lies a complex man whose journey from a Virginia planter to the father of his country was anything but straightforward. He was a man of immense courage, profound integrity, and like the nation he helped create, a man grappling with deep contradictions. We're going to embark on a comprehensive journey through Washington's life, from his formative years on the Virginia frontier, through the crucible of war, his pivotal role in forging the Constitution, and his groundbreaking presidency. We'll explore not just the what, but the how and the why, examining the choices he made, the challenges he faced, and the enduring precedents he set. So, settle in, because we're about to peel back the layers of history and truly understand the man behind the myth. Let's begin at the very beginning, with Washington's formative years and his early encounters with the frontier, a period spanning from 1732 to 1754. Born on February 23, 1732, at Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia, George was the first child of Augustine Washington and his second wife, Mary Ball Washington. The Washingtons were firmly entrenched in the Virginia gentry, a class defined by land ownership and, crucially, the institution of slavery. Augustine was a man of enterprise, owning several plantations, engaging in iron mining, and dabbling in land speculation. This was the world George was born into, a world of privilege, but also one of constant work and ambition. His lineage, like many prominent Virginians, traced back to England, with his great-grandfather John Washington having emigrated in 1657. Throughout his childhood, George moved between various family estates along the Rappahannock and Potomac rivers, a semi-nomadic existence that exposed him to different facets of colonial life. But a significant turning point came at the tender age of 11, when his father, Augustine, passed away. This event had profound implications for young George. While he received a modest inheritance, including 10 enslaved people, his formal education was abruptly cut short. This meant he missed out on the classical schooling and university education that his older half-brothers and many of his future political peers enjoyed. Imagine for a moment the future President of the United States, lacking the formal academic credentials of his contemporaries. It's a stark contrast to the intellectual giants like Jefferson and Madison. However, this wasn't a complete deficit. Instead, George received a practical education, one steeped in mathematics, trigonometry, and land surveying. This practical bent would prove far more valuable in his early career than any amount of Latin or Greek. And here's where his half-brother, Lawrence Washington, enters the picture as a pivotal figure. Lawrence was a man of the world, having served in the Royal Navy, and perhaps more importantly, married into the powerful Fairfax family. The Fairfaxes were one of the wealthiest and most influential families in Virginia, holding vast tracts of land. George spent considerable time at Lawrence's estate, Mount Vernon, which would later become his own cherished home. It was at Mount Vernon that he was exposed to the refined manners, morals, and lifestyle of the Virginian elite. This was his finishing school, his university of social graces and ambition. And it was here, amidst the elegance and intellectual discussions, that George developed a keen interest in two intertwined pursuits that would define his early career: military arts and Western exploration. This brings us to his role as a surveyor and his adventures in the wilderness. At 16, George's proficiency in surveying, honed by that practical education, caught the eye of Thomas, Lord Fairfax. Lord Fairfax, a distant relative by marriage, owned an immense, untamed expanse of land in the Shenandoah Valley, and he needed someone capable and trustworthy to map it out. For 3 years, Washington embarked on this transformative journey as a surveyor. This wasn't just a job, it was an education in itself. It provided him with a steady income, allowing him to purchase his own prime frontier land, a smart investment that would form the basis of his future wealth. More importantly, it immersed him in the rigors of wilderness living. Imagine the challenges: navigating uncharted territories, facing harsh weather, encountering diverse Native American tribes, and relying on his own wits and resilience. This experience, more than anything else, instilled in Washington an intimate knowledge of the Western territories and a lifelong conviction in the economic and strategic importance of westward expansion. He saw the potential, the vast resources, and the future of the young colonies lying beyond the established settlements. During this period, he also had a brush with mortality, one that would ironically grant him a significant advantage later in life. In 1751, he accompanied his half-brother Lawrence, who was suffering from tuberculosis, to Barbados. The hope was that the tropical climate would restore Lawrence's health. While there, George contracted smallpox. The illness left him with permanent facial scars, a physical reminder of his vulnerability. But crucially, it also granted him lifelong immunity to the disease. This might seem like a minor detail, but smallpox was a devastating scourge in the 18th century, capable of wiping out entire armies. Washington's immunity would prove to be a critical factor during the Revolutionary War, protecting him from a disease that would decimate many of his troops. Tragically, Lawrence died shortly after their return to Virginia in 1752, leaving a profound void in George's life, and in a twist of fate, eventually leading to George inheriting Mount Vernon. With Lawrence's passing, Washington, at the age of 20, found himself stepping into a new role, a major in the Virginia militia. This marked the true beginning of his military career, and it was quickly thrown into the fire of international conflict. By 1753, tensions between the British and French over control of the Ohio River Valley had reached a boiling point. This vast, resource-rich territory was a strategic prize, and both empires sought to claim it. Virginia's Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie recognized the urgency of asserting British territorial claims and dispatched Washington on a hazardous diplomatic mission to the French frontier. His task? Deliver an ultimatum demanding their withdrawal. This winter journey through the unforgiving wilderness was arduous, a true test of endurance and leadership. Washington navigated treacherous terrain, faced hostile conditions, and ultimately delivered his message, solidifying his reputation back home as a hardy, capable, and dedicated servant of the Crown. Upon his return, Washington was promptly promoted to lieutenant colonel and placed in command of a regiment. His mission was to reinforce a strategic outpost at the forks of the Ohio, the site of modern-day Pittsburgh. This was a critical juncture, a choke point for westward expansion and trade. In May 1754, while advancing through the wilderness, Washington's forces, allied with a group of Mingo warriors, led by Tanacharison, surprised a small party of French troops. This skirmish, known as the Battle of Jumonville Glen, proved to be a fateful encounter. The French commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, was killed. This single event, a relatively minor clash in the grand scheme of things, is widely considered the spark that ignited the French and Indian War, a conflict that would quickly spread to Europe and become known as the 7 Years' War, a truly global conflagration. It's remarkable to think that a young, inexperienced officer's actions in the American wilderness could trigger such a massive international conflict. Following the skirmish, Washington, recognizing the need for a defensive position, hastily constructed Fort Necessity. However, his position was precarious. In July 1754, a larger force of French and Native Americans besieged the fort, and Washington was ultimately forced to surrender. The capitulation document he signed contained a damning admission that he had assassinated Jumonville. Washington later claimed this was a mistranslation he was unaware of when he signed the document, a crucial detail that highlights the complexities of communication and diplomacy in the colonial era. Though the surrender was undoubtedly a military setback, it didn't disgrace Washington. In fact, he was thanked by the Virginia House of Burgesses, and perhaps more importantly, gained vital, humbling experience in commanding troops in the field. He learned firsthand the harsh realities of warfare, the challenges of logistics, and the unpredictability of battle. His military education continued in 1755, when he served as a volunteer aide-de-camp to British General Edward Braddock during the ill-fated Braddock Expedition. This was an ambitious campaign aimed at capturing Fort Duquesne, a key French stronghold. During the ensuing Battle of the Monongahela, the British forces were ambushed and utterly routed by a combined force of French and Native Americans. It was a catastrophic defeat, but it was also where Washington's bravery under fire became legendary. Imagine the chaos, the terror of an ambush. Despite having 2 horses shot from under him and 4 bullets tearing through his coat, Washington remained remarkably composed. He helped organize the desperate retreat, demonstrating a leadership under pressure that few could match. His conduct earned him widespread praise, and critically, the command of the entire Virginia regiment. This was a grueling assignment, tasked with defending a 300-mile frontier against relentless Native American raids. Washington served in this capacity until 1758, gaining invaluable organizational and tactical experience, honing his command skills, and deepening his understanding of frontier warfare before finally resigning his commission and returning to civilian life. He had spent years in the wilderness, fighting and learning, and was now ready for a different chapter. This brings us to part 2 of his life, the planter and politician, covering the years 1759 to 1775. Shortly after resigning from the military in early 1759, Washington underwent 2 major life changes that would profoundly shape his future. First, he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, marking his formal entry into the political arena. Second, and perhaps even more immediately impactful, he married Martha Dandridge Custis. Martha was a 27-year-old widow, and by all accounts, she was intelligent, gracious, and significantly one of the wealthiest women in Virginia. Her late husband, Daniel Parke Custis, had left behind a massive fortune, a veritable empire that included thousands of acres of land and hundreds of enslaved people. While their marriage did not produce children of their own, George became a devoted stepfather to Martha's 2 surviving children, John Parke Jackie and Martha Parke Patsy Custis. The marriage fundamentally altered Washington's social and economic status. Combined with his own land acquisitions from his surveying days and his military bounties, the Custis inheritance transformed Washington into one of the wealthiest men in the colonies. This newfound wealth provided him with the financial independence and social standing necessary to pursue larger ambitions, both as a planter and a politician. With his considerable wealth, Washington was able to expand Mount Vernon, his beloved estate. He transformed it into a nearly 8,000-acre agricultural enterprise, a testament to his ambition and meticulous attention to detail. He wasn't just a gentleman farmer, he was an innovator. He spent countless hours experimenting with crop rotation, livestock breeding, and landscaping. Unlike many of his peers who relied almost exclusively on tobacco, a crop that quickly depleted the soil, Washington diversified his operations. He focused on wheat and flour production, even operating his own grist mill and fishery. This forward-thinking approach made Mount Vernon a highly productive and profitable estate, a model of agricultural efficiency in the colonies. However, behind the prosperity of Mount Vernon, and indeed the entire Virginian economy, was a stark and brutal reality: the grueling forced labor of hundreds of enslaved people. Washington's relationship with the institution of slavery is one of the most complex and troubling aspects of his legacy, and it's essential to confront it head-on. Like many of the Virginia gentry, he grew up accepting slavery as a natural and unquestioned part of the economic and social order. It was simply the way things were. Yet as he matured, particularly during and after the Revolutionary War, his views began to evolve. He privately expressed deep moral misgivings about the institution, noting that he wished to see it abolished by law. He wrestled with this contradiction, a man fighting for liberty while owning other human beings. Nevertheless, throughout his lifetime, he continued to utilize enslaved labor to maintain his wealth and lifestyle, and even actively pursued runaway slaves, despite his growing moral conflicts. This internal struggle, this profound irony, is a crucial part of understanding Washington, and indeed, the American founding itself. His political awakening continued during his tenure in the Virginia House of Burgesses, which began in 1759, and provided him with nearly 2 decades of political experience. While he was never a fiery orator or a prolific writer of political pamphlets, unlike some of his contemporaries, he was a respected, studious, and deeply engaged legislator. He was known for his quiet observation, his careful deliberation, and his integrity. During his early years in the Burgesses, he quietly observed the growing tensions between the American colonies and the British Parliament, a slow burn that would eventually erupt into revolution. The turning point for Washington, as for many colonial leaders, was the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765 and the subsequent British taxation measures. These acts, which imposed taxes on various printed materials, were seen by Washington as direct violations of the rights of Englishmen and an unconstitutional overreach by Parliament. He believed that the colonists, lacking direct representation in Parliament, should not be subjected to such taxation. He became an early supporter of non-importation agreements, which were essentially boycotts of British goods, a powerful economic weapon designed to pressure Parliament to repeal the oppressive taxes. As the 1770s progressed, Washington's opposition to British policies hardened. He came to believe that the Crown's actions threatened the very liberties and property rights of the colonists, principles he held dear. In 1774, Washington's growing political prominence led to his selection as a delegate to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. This was a momentous gathering where colonial leaders convened to coordinate a unified response to the intolerable acts, a series of punitive measures imposed by Britain after the Boston Tea Party. While Congress initially sought to petition the king and utilize economic boycotts rather than declare outright independence, Washington, ever the pragmatist and military man, prepared for the possibility of armed conflict. He resumed his military activities, helping to organize and drill local militias in Virginia, understanding that diplomacy alone might not be enough. By the time the Second Continental Congress met in 1775, the shot heard round the world had already been fired at Lexington and Concord, and the colonies were undeniably on the brink of war. The time for peaceful protest was over. The time for action had arrived. This sets the stage for Part 3, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, covering the years 1775 to 1783, the heart of the American Revolution. In June 1775, with war now a reality, the Second Continental Congress established the Continental Army, and in a moment of extraordinary foresight, unanimously elected George Washington as its commander-in-chief. This wasn't a casual decision, it was a strategic one. Washington was chosen for several crucial reasons. As a Virginian, his appointment helped secure the critical support of the southern colonies for what was, at that point, largely a New England-dominated conflict. This was essential for forging a truly united front. Furthermore, his previous military experience in the French and Indian War, his imposing physical stature, and his natural command presence made him the most logical candidate for the position. He looked the part, and he had proven his mettle. Washington accepted the command, but in a display of his commitment to public service, he refused to accept a salary, requesting only that his expenses be reimbursed. This set an early precedent for selfless leadership. Upon arriving in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in July 1775, Washington was faced with a daunting reality. The Continental Army was less an army and more a disorganized, poorly equipped, and undisciplined collection of local militias. Imagine trying to forge a unified fighting force from such disparate elements. He immediately set about establishing order, implementing strict military discipline, improving sanitation, a critical factor for preventing disease, and securing desperately needed supplies and gunpowder. He also commissioned Henry Knox, a brilliant young artillery officer, to transport captured British artillery from Fort Ticonderoga over the winter, an incredible feat of logistics. In March 1776, Washington utilized this artillery to fortify Dorchester Heights, strategically overlooking Boston Harbor. The threat of these cannons, placed in a commanding position, forced the British to evacuate Boston, marking Washington's first major victory of the war and a significant morale boost for the fledgling nation. Anticipating that the British would next target New York City, a key port and strategic location, Washington moved his army south. The campaign in New York, however, proved to be a harrowing trial for the American forces. In August 1776, the British launched a massive invasion, deploying an overwhelming force that defeated Washington's army at the Battle of Long Island. Over the next several months, Washington was repeatedly outmaneuvered by General William Howe, the British commander. In a series of retreats that showcased both his strategic flexibility and the precarious state of his army, Washington evacuated New York, crossed New Jersey, and retreated into Pennsylvania. This was a dark period for the American cause, a series of defeats that tested the resolve of both the soldiers and the nascent government. With the enlistment of most of his soldiers set to expire at the end of the year, the American cause faced a severe crisis of morale. The revolution was on the verge of collapse. Washington desperately needed a decisive victory to keep it alive. On the freezing night of December 25, 1776, he executed one of the most daring and iconic maneuvers in military history. He led his army across the icy Delaware River in a surprise attack. The following morning, the Continental Army routed the Hessian garrison at the Battle of Trenton, capturing nearly 1,000 prisoners. Washington followed this up with another tactical victory at the Battle of Princeton in January 1777. These victories, coming at such a critical moment, electrified the colonies, revived sagging morale, and perhaps most importantly, proved that the Continental Army, despite its disadvantages, could defeat professional European soldiers. It was a lifeline for the Revolution. Despite these successes in New Jersey, Washington faced significant challenges in 1777. The British launched a campaign to capture the American capital of Philadelphia, defeating Washington at the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. Although Washington was unable to prevent the British from occupying Philadelphia, he managed to keep his army intact, a crucial strategic achievement in itself. Losing the capital was a blow, but preserving the army meant the fight could continue. In December 1777, Washington marched his weary, freezing, and starving army into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The winter at Valley Forge is widely remembered as the nadir, the lowest point of the Continental Army. Thousands of soldiers died of disease, exposure, and malnutrition, driven by severe supply failures and a lack of adequate congressional support. It was a brutal test of endurance and leadership. Yet, paradoxically, it also proved to be a period of vital transformation. Washington worked tirelessly to keep his men together, shared their hardships, and crucially, instituted a rigorous training program led by the Prussian officer Baron von Steuben. Von Steuben, a master of European military drill and tactics, transformed the ragtag militias into a disciplined professional fighting force capable of matching the British in formal European warfare. Valley Forge, despite its horrors, forged the Continental Army into a truly effective fighting machine. In 1778, the entry of France into the war as an American ally fundamentally changed the strategic landscape. France, seeking revenge against Britain after the 7 Years' War, provided crucial financial aid, naval support, and military assistance. The British, now facing a global conflict, evacuated Philadelphia to consolidate their forces in New York, leading Washington to order an attack at the Battle of Monmouth. While the battle ended in a tactical draw, it demonstrated the effectiveness of Washington's newly trained army, proving that Valley Forge had indeed worked. The middle years of the war were characterized by logistical struggles, mutinies, and the existential threat of treason, most notably the 1780 plot by General Benedict Arnold to surrender the strategic fort at West Point to the British. Arnold, a brilliant but embittered general, felt unappreciated and turned traitor, a shocking betrayal that shook the American cause. Despite these setbacks and the constant pressure, Washington maintained overall strategic command. He utilized espionage networks, kept a watchful eye on the British, and most importantly, maintained the cohesion of the army, even as the focus of the war shifted to the southern colonies. His ability to hold the army together through lean times was a testament to his extraordinary leadership. The climax of the war arrived in the summer of 1781. Washington received word that a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing for the Chesapeake Bay, and a French army, commanded by the Comte de Rochambeau, was available to combine forces with the Continental Army. Recognizing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to trap the British Army under Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia, Washington executed a brilliant and secretive march from New York to Virginia. It was a masterpiece of strategic deception and rapid movement. In September 1781, Allied American and French forces surrounded Cornwallis at Yorktown. Washington personally fired the first American cannon at the beginning of the siege, which lasted for several weeks. Surrounded, outnumbered, and bombarded relentlessly by artillery, Cornwallis had no choice. He surrendered his army of over 7,000 men on October 19, 1781. The victory at Yorktown essentially secured American independence, effectively ending major military operations in North America. It was a resounding triumph, the culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice. Though the war was won, the most difficult test of Washington's leadership may have occurred in early 1783 in Newburgh, New York. The Continental Army, having spent years without adequate pay or supplies, was on the verge of a mutiny. Angry officers, feeling betrayed by a financially struggling Congress, threatened to march on Philadelphia and overthrow the Continental Congress to demand their compensation. This was an existential threat to the very republic they had fought to create, a moment where the military could have easily seized power. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Washington intervened decisively. He convened a meeting of his officers and delivered an impassioned speech, urging them to maintain their faith in Congress and the American cause, reminding them of the ideals they had fought for. Famously, as he struggled to read his notes, he pulled out a pair of newly acquired reading glasses, telling his men, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." The simple, human gesture, revealing his personal sacrifice, disarmed the mutineers. It was an emotional appeal that solidified Washington's legacy as a champion of civilian authority over the military. A truly unprecedented act in an era where victorious generals often became dictators. In December 1783, Washington traveled to Annapolis, Maryland, and formally resigned his military commission as commander-in-chief. This was a stunning and unprecedented act in world history. Instead of seizing political power, he surrendered it to Congress and returned to the life of a private citizen at Mount Vernon. This act of voluntary relinquishment of power, a Cincinnatus-like return to his farm, sent a powerful message to the world about the nature of the American experiment. This brings us to Part 4, the Constitutional Convention and Nation Building, covering the crucial years from 1783 to 1789. Upon returning to Mount Vernon in late 1783, Washington genuinely hoped to resume his life as a gentleman farmer. He spent his time repairing his estate, which had suffered from neglect during the long years of war, and hosting a steady stream of guests and visitors who came to pay their respects to the victorious general. He also continued to indulge his lifelong interest in the Western Territories, undertaking a 600-mile journey to the Ohio Valley to inspect his land holdings and study the potential for inland navigation and trade. He was a man who understood the value of land and the importance of infrastructure. However, his peace was short-lived. It soon became clear to Washington, and other prominent leaders that the young republic was struggling under the Articles of Confederation. The national government, created during the war, was dangerously weak. It lacked the fundamental power to tax, regulate interstate commerce, or maintain a standing army. This meant it couldn't pay its debts, couldn't resolve disputes between states, and couldn't adequately defend itself. Economic instability, interstate disputes, and uprisings like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, where indebted farmers rebelled against foreclosures, exposed the profound fragility of the post-war Confederation. Washington, who corresponded extensively with political leaders like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, grew increasingly concerned about the survival of the nation. He feared that the immense sacrifices made during the Revolution would be squandered if the states dissolved into separate, warring entities, becoming a mere collection of squabbling provinces. He advocated passionately for a stronger, more energetic national government, one capable of unifying the country and protecting its sovereignty. He understood that without a strong central authority, the American experiment was doomed to fail. In 1787, responding to these growing crises, delegates from across the states gathered in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. This gathering, of course, became the Constitutional Convention. Washington was unanimously chosen to preside over the convention, a testament to his unparalleled prestige and moral authority. While he did not participate in the daily debates, preferring to maintain an impartial role, his presence was absolutely crucial to the success of the convention. His immense prestige gave the gathering legitimacy in the eyes of the public, assuring them that serious, responsible men were at work. And his steady, neutral leadership helped guide the delegates through contentious debates over the structure of government, representation, and the delicate balance of power between states and the federal government. He was the anchor that kept the ship from capsizing during many stormy sessions. After months of intense deliberation, the delegates produced the United States Constitution. Washington was the first to sign the document, a powerful endorsement. He then actively lent his immense political weight to the subsequent ratification debates, touring the states and writing letters to convince a skeptical public. His support was a major factor in the eventual adoption of the Constitution by the states. Without Washington's unique combination of military glory, personal integrity, and political influence, it's highly debatable whether the Constitution would have been ratified at all. This leads us into Part 5, the First Presidency, from 1789 to 1797. Following the ratification of the Constitution, the first presidential election was held in early 1789. There was only one serious candidate. George Washington was the unanimous choice of the Electoral College, the only president in American history to be elected unanimously. This wasn't just a political victory. It was a reflection of the nation's profound trust in him. Reluctantly, Washington left his retirement at Mount Vernon and traveled to New York City, which was then the temporary capital of the nation. On April 30th, 1789, standing on the balcony of Federal Hall, Washington took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. He understood the immense weight of his position. In a letter to James Madison, Washington noted, "As the first of everything, in our situation will serve to establish a precedent. It is devoutly wished on my part that these precedents may be fixed on true principles." He recognized that every action he took, every decision he made, would set a template for all future presidents. The success or failure of the American experiment in Republican government depended on how he conducted himself in office. He was literally building the presidency from scratch, with no roadmap to guide him. Washington had to build the executive branch from the ground up. The Constitution provided a basic outline of the presidency, but Washington had to fill in the operational details, much like a blueprint needs a builder to make it a reality. He established the first presidential cabinet, creating a council of advisors consisting of the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, and the Attorney General, Edmund Randolph. This was not explicitly outlined in the Constitution. It was Washington's innovation. He utilized his cabinet to debate major policy issues and build consensus, establishing a precedent that all future presidents would follow. It was a crucial mechanism for bringing diverse perspectives to the highest levels of government. He also navigated the delicate balance of executive power, defining the relationship between the president and Congress. He worked to establish the dignity and authority of the office, while consciously avoiding the trappings of European royalty. He preferred to be addressed simply as Mr. President, rather than grandiose royal titles, a subtle but powerful rejection of monarchy. And he instituted weekly public levees to ensure the president remained accessible to citizens, further emphasizing the republican nature of the office. He was creating the office, but also defining its democratic character. One of the most pressing challenges facing the new administration was the massive national and state debt incurred during the Revolutionary War. The young nation's credit was in tatters. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, a brilliant but sometimes controversial figure, proposed an ambitious financial plan. This plan included the federal assumption of state debts, the creation of a national bank to stabilize the currency and provide credit, and the implementation of tariffs and excise taxes to generate revenue. Hamilton's plan was highly controversial, particularly the excise tax on whiskey, which sparked significant opposition among farmers and frontier settlers who used whiskey as a form of currency and a vital part of their economy. Washington, however, supported Hamilton's financial program, believing it was absolutely essential for establishing the nation's credit and financial stability. He understood that without a strong economy, the nation couldn't survive. But the opposition to the whiskey tax eventually boiled over into open defiance in western Pennsylvania, culminating in the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. The rebels attacked tax collectors, disrupted the judicial process, and challenged the very authority of the federal government. Viewing this armed resistance as a direct threat to the authority of the federal government and the rule of law, Washington took decisive action. He invoked the Militia Act of 1792 and personally led a militia force of over 12,000 men into western Pennsylvania. This was an astonishing display of presidential power and resolve. The sheer show of force quelled the rebellion without a major battle. Washington's handling of the Whiskey Rebellion demonstrated unequivocally that the federal government had the will and the power to enforce its laws and maintain public order. It was a critical test of the new Constitution's strength, and Washington passed it with flying colors. In foreign affairs, Washington's presidency was dominated by the escalating conflicts in Europe, particularly the French Revolution and the subsequent war between Great Britain and France. The United States was in a precarious position. It was economically tied to Great Britain, its primary trading partner, but politically and ideologically indebted to France, its key ally during the American Revolution. The nation was caught between a rock and a hard place. The outbreak of war in Europe deeply divided Washington's cabinet, reflecting the nascent partisan divisions within the country. Thomas Jefferson, a Francophile, favored the French, while Alexander Hamilton, who admired the British financial system, supported the British. Washington, however, recognized that the United States was a young, fragile nation that could not afford to be drawn into a devastating European conflict. It simply didn't have the military or economic strength. In 1793, he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, declaring that the United States would remain friendly and impartial toward both warring nations. This was a bold and pragmatic stance, prioritizing American interests above ideological alliances. Washington also sought to avoid another war with Great Britain, knowing that such a conflict could cripple the young nation. He sent Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate a treaty. The resulting Jay Treaty, ratified in 1795, resolved several outstanding issues from the Revolutionary War, such as British forts on American soil and impressment of American sailors, and secured a period of peace and lucrative trade with Britain. While the treaty was heavily criticized by Jeffersonian Republicans who viewed it as too favorable to the British, it succeeded in its primary goal, keeping the United States out of a devastating foreign war, buying the young nation precious time to grow and strengthen. Washington also secured peace in the West by authorizing General Anthony Wayne to defeat the Northwest Indian Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which led to the Treaty of Greenville, opening up much of present-day Ohio to settlement. This demonstrated the federal government's commitment to securing its borders and promoting westward expansion. While Washington grappled with the challenges of a growing nation, he also had to navigate the institution of slavery within the context of the federal capital, which moved from New York to Philadelphia in 1790. This presented a unique legal dilemma. Under Pennsylvania law, enslaved people who were brought into the state by their masters and resided there for 6 months were legally entitled to their freedom. To prevent his enslaved household workers from gaining their freedom, Washington utilized a legal loophole by rotating them back and forth between Philadelphia and his Mount Vernon estate, ensuring they never stayed in Pennsylvania long enough to qualify for freedom. This practice, known as the Philadelphia Experiment, is a stark reminder of the lengths to which even a man who privately expressed moral misgivings about slavery would go to protect his property. Although he privately expressed a desire to rid himself of enslaved labor, he continued the practice throughout his presidency. A profound and painful contradiction that continues to challenge his legacy. This leads us to Part 6, Retirement and Final Years, from 1797 to 1799. In 1796, Washington set one of his most significant precedents by refusing to accept a third term as president. Despite being urged by many political leaders to remain in office, Washington firmly believed that the presidency should not be a lifelong position, and that a peaceful transfer of power was essential to a healthy republic. He feared that perpetual leadership would lead to monarchy or tyranny. This voluntary relinquishment of power, once again, was a powerful statement about the nature of American democracy. Before leaving office, Washington published his famous farewell address in September 1796. Written primarily with the help of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, the address was not delivered orally, but published as a letter to the American people. It served as a political testament and a guide for the future of the nation, a parting piece of wisdom from the father of his country. In the address, Washington urged Americans to cherish the unity of the federal government and to guard against sectional divisions, understanding that a fractured nation would be a weak one. He also warned heavily against the corrupting influence of political parties, arguing that they would lead to tyranny and division, a warning that in hindsight seems remarkably prescient. In the realm of foreign policy, Washington offered the defining advice that the United States should avoid permanent alliances with foreign nations, advocating instead for a policy of neutrality and independence. He believed that entanglement in European conflicts would distract the young nation from its own development and prosperity. He stressed the importance of maintaining public credit, morality, and religion as the pillars of a prosperous society, emphasizing the civic virtues he believed were necessary for a functioning republic. In March 1797, after the inauguration of his successor, John Adams, Washington finally retired from public life and returned to his beloved Mount Vernon. At the age of 65, he resumed his life as a farmer and businessman, finding solace in the routines of agricultural management. He spent his final years overseeing his agricultural operations, entertaining guests, and managing his financial investments. He was at heart a planter who happened to have led a revolution and founded a nation. Even in his retirement, Washington's status as a national icon remained unmatched. When tensions between the United States and France escalated into the Quasi-War in 1798, President Adams, recognizing the immense symbolic power of Washington, appointed him as the commander-in-chief of the Provisional Army. While Washington did not take an active command in the field, his willingness to serve a final time, even in old age, demonstrated his continued dedication to his country's defense. Washington's retirement was tragically short, On December 12, 1799, he spent several hours inspecting his farm on horseback, in cold, snowy, and rainy weather, a testament to his lifelong dedication to his estate. He returned home chilled and with a severe sore throat. The following day, he awoke with difficulty breathing, a condition diagnosed at the time as quinsy or severe croup. Washington's doctors were summoned, and they employed traditional 18th-century medical treatments, which, by modern standards, were often more harmful than helpful. These included multiple rounds of bloodletting, blistering, and the administration of calomel and gargles. Despite their efforts, Washington's continued to deteriorate rapidly. Recognizing that he was dying, he gave instructions regarding his burial and passed away peacefully on the night of December 14, 1799, at the age of 67. His last reported words were, "'Tis well," reflecting his stoic acceptance of his death. The news of Washington's death sent waves of grief across the United States and the world. Both the United States and Great Britain, even while engaged in war, went into official mourning, a remarkable tribute to his global stature. Memorial services were held across the country, and people from all walks of life mourned the loss of the father of his country. In his will, Washington issued provisions for the enslaved people he owned. This is where the complexity of his legacy regarding slavery reaches its final, poignant chapter. Under his marriage agreement with Martha, George could not free the enslaved people who belonged to the Custis estate, as they were her dower property. However, regarding the 123 enslaved people he owned outright, Washington stipulated in his will that they were to be freed following the death of his wife, Martha. He also left funds for the care of elderly and young freed individuals. Martha, in a testament to her respect for his wishes, and perhaps her own evolving conscience, freed her late husband's enslaved workers a year after his death, in 1801. This act, while posthumous, was one of the most significant manumissions by a founding father, a powerful, if belated, statement against the institution he had once so readily accepted. Finally, we arrive at Part 7, Legacy and Historical Evaluation. George Washington's legacy is defined as much by what he did as by what he refrained from doing. As the first president, he established a template for the executive branch that has endured for centuries. He successfully navigated the separation of powers, created the cabinet system, and established the tradition of the peaceful transfer of power by voluntarily surrendering the presidency after 2 terms. His deliberate restraint and unwavering commitment to Republican principles prevented the American presidency from developing into a monarchy or a military dictatorship, a fate that befell many other revolutionary leaders throughout history. This was his greatest gift to the nation, the example of limited power. Washington was also instrumental in the survival of the United States Constitution. His leadership at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 gave the document the legitimacy required for ratification, and his subsequent presidency demonstrated that the framework of the new government was viable and capable of maintaining national unity and stability. He literally brought the Constitution to life. He was celebrated for his stoicism, personal integrity, and immense courage. While not an intellectual in the vein of Jefferson or Madison, he possessed a keen judgment, an ability to listen to expert advice, and an exceptional capacity to learn from his mistakes. He was a master of organization and logistics, a skill honed during his surveying days and military campaigns. And he demonstrated an extraordinary ability to maintain morale and cohesion in the face of near insurmountable odds. His leadership during the darkest days of the Revolutionary War, particularly at Valley Forge, stands as a testament to his resilience. Throughout his life, Washington was deeply concerned with his reputation and personal honor. He was acutely aware that his actions would be scrutinized by history, and he carefully cultivated the image of a selfless, public-spirited leader who placed the good of his country above his own personal ambition or financial gain. He understood that to lead a republic, he had to embody its highest ideals. In modern evaluations, Washington's historical legacy is inextricably linked to the profound irony of a man who fought for liberty while participating in the system of chattel slavery. This is a crucial aspect of understanding his complexity. Washington owned hundreds of enslaved people throughout his life, and his wealth and lifestyle were built upon the forced labor of Black Americans. While historians acknowledge that Washington's personal views on slavery evolved over his lifetime, from an unquestioning acceptance of the institution in his youth to a growing private opposition in his later years, he did not take decisive political action to abolish slavery during his presidency. His failure to confront the institution is viewed by many as the central contradiction of the American founding, a stain on the nation's proclaimed ideals of liberty and equality. Nonetheless, his decision to free his own enslaved people in his will, a significant act that challenged the prevailing norms of his time, marked one of the most significant manumissions by a founding father, a posthumous step towards rectifying this deep moral failing. George Washington's influence extended far beyond the borders of the United States. In an era dominated by monarchies, his decision to relinquish supreme military and political power captivated the global imagination. He was widely viewed as a modern Cincinnatus, the Roman statesman who left his farm to save his republic and returned to his plow after his victory. Washington embodied this ideal, demonstrating that true leadership lay not in grasping power, but in surrendering it for the good of the people. Washington's life and career represent the foundational triumphs and the deep-seated contradictions of the United States. He was a visionary who foresaw the growth and potential of the American West, a general who held a fragile army together to win independence, and a statesman who set the institutional framework for a democratic republic. He was the indispensable man, the one figure without whom the American experiment might well have failed. In both popular and scholarly polls, George Washington is consistently ranked as one of the greatest presidents in American history. His image is an icon of American culture, and his namesakes include the national capital, the state of Washington, and countless institutions across the globe. Ultimately, Washington's greatest legacy was his ability to transform the abstract ideals of the American Revolution into a living, functioning reality, earning him the enduring title of the Father of his country. So, as we wrap up today's deep dive, what are the key takeaways from George Washington's extraordinary life? First, understand that his leadership was forged in the crucible of the frontier and military conflict. His practical education, his surveying experience, and his service in the French and Indian War, despite early setbacks, laid the groundwork for his later command. Second, recognize the profound transformation he underwent, from a wealthy planter who initially accepted slavery to a man who privately wrestled with its morality and ultimately freed his own enslaved people in his will. This evolution, while incomplete, is a critical part of his story. Third, appreciate his indispensable role in both winning the Revolutionary War and establishing the United States as a viable republic. His ability to hold the Continental Army together, his strategic brilliance at Yorktown, and his Cincinnatus-like surrender of power at Newburgh were all vital. Fourth, remember his pivotal leadership at the Constitutional Convention and his groundbreaking presidency, where he literally built the executive branch from scratch, setting precedents for everything from the cabinet system to the peaceful transfer of power. And finally, consider the enduring wisdom of his farewell address, particularly his warnings against factionalism and foreign entanglements, advice that still resonates today. George Washington was not a perfect man, but he was a truly consequential one. He was a figure of immense integrity, courage, and foresight, whose actions and inactions continue to shape the United States. His legacy is a complex tapestry of triumph and contradiction, a reflection of the nation he helped to found. And by understanding him, in all his facets, we gain a deeper appreciation for the principles and paradoxes that lie at the heart of the American story. Thank you for joining me on Founding Principles. I hope you've gained a richer understanding of George Washington today. Join us next time as we explore another pivotal figure in American history. Until then, keep digging into the past, because the foundations of our present are always there to be discovered.